So yes, Harris Elliott. I run Harris Elliott Studio, as well as involved in a number of other projects. And in terms of thinking about the topics of, or the wider frame of generalist, specialist, wanted to kind of drill down in some of the ways that we work from my studio and pose this question rather than make a statement. And can you be culturally relevant and also commercially viable at the same time? Um, for years, in the main, in terms of advertising, it was middle class white guys that defined what was culturally relevant and what stories should be told. And that's not to say that those stories that were told would only be from that perspective. Other stories and other stories could be shared and could be told, but over the past number of years, and even more pressing over the last few months and weeks and past year, the world has changed, and culture, which has always defined what was relevant, but now even more pressing, culture is defining what stories need to be told, and we're less needing to be brand led and less sold to, but as communities and as groups which are not necessarily from the commercial sector have got the space in which they are able to share their own narratives, their own views, their own layers, their own practices, which become more relevant than just the aspect of what can we sell to you or what can be sold to us, and how indigenous communities can actually share what is real and what's relevant, and how that can then be amplified to present culture in different ways. So then, in that nutshell, it's the gatekeepers have been released. Quite often the gatekeepers might be seen as those that are in power, but the gatekeepers towards culture, and culture in its widest sense. When I refer to culture, I talk about brands have culture, communities have culture, families have culture. So those of you who are in tune with your own particular local groups or within families or movements or certain areas, whether you skate, whether you dance, whether you sing, whatever it would be, you are now, given where we're at within time and within society and in space, that you or we or they are the actual gatekeepers of what real stories are and of what real culture is and how it should be shared and how it can be amplified, because those stories will be authentic, because those are the people who actually understand those narratives truly, because they've lived them, they've breathed them, they've built them, they've created them from the ground up, whether that is through nature or nurture, but they were a part of that exchange. And so, as that's the case, we also need to start thinking about how language has changed and how language is used within the narratives that we express and that we put out, because it's not top-led anymore. There's an analogy that I often use, which is we should live global but think local, which is the reverse of how it's often used within advertising, in the sense that we all live connected to many different people around the world, but when we create from the benefit and for the objective and the purpose for people within local communities. And by local could be a country, but it's specific to them, not me just telling you what I think you should be doing, but what actually is going to be best for you. Those are the stories that we should be expressing and developing. So just going to share a bit of background. These are some of the things that inspired me growing up. First single I bought was Adam and the Ants, then was really inspired by window displays, then got into hip hop. First 12-inch I bought was Salt and Pepper, and Public Enemy in my mid-teens. There was a point where an art form of hip hop that I was really into showed me that I could be political in the way that I think, or art can also have another political strain as opposed to being something that's just about entertainment. I studied interior architecture and design, but all of my friends were graphic designers. So at the time, I was learning about the artist Ian Wright, who still apparently to this day doesn't really use a computer or a laptop to create so much of his work. He creates really incredible illustrations and graphics, but using either a photocopier or other materials around him. And then there was Swifty, who came out of the stable or the studio of Neville Brody, who did the Young Disciples single cover. And then there was the iconoclast that was Judy Blaine, the art director, stylist, jewelry maker. And he worked on titles like The Face and with brands from Joe Malone through to Comme des Garçons. And then as you go through, you start looking at all the different things that would continue to influence the way that you look at things. I work an awful lot, or as a studio, we work with a lot of Japanese brands and a lot of Japanese companies and ateliers. And so the manhole covers, it's a Instagram feed that I follow, and it's that point that when you're in these different places that you travel to, it's the different aspects within those cultures and spaces that can influence and inspire in other ways. And the manhole covers such a simple but brutalist kind of object which we step over daily. Even that can be an object of beauty. So even though it has to have millions of people stepping on it daily, weekly, monthly, even that can be a piece of beauty if you choose to look at things in a certain way in terms of how you will manifest and express culture. Hip hop, I'm a big Wu-Tang fan, but more from an ideology of how a group of people came together to have one message, but can have separate messages which all still stand really strong together. So very much about community and collectivity. Jean-Paul Goude with Grace Jones there, and this is someone who I started following recently, Mr. Flower Fantastic, who is using the art form of floristry, but utilizing it within hip-hop culture and a framework. So there's a pair of Nike Air Max, which is made out of flowers. It's really important to know what is your vision and what's your unique point of view. It's how to affect culture and to affect change in the different things that you do. It's knowing what that vision is and how that's then going to be amplified and presented in different ways. These are some of the other people that I was looking at when I was coming through, which were, as I'd studied architecture and interior architecture, it's looking at the designers and the architects from around the world and the artists, Christo in the middle, Tadao Ando, Ron Arad. And it's how you look at things and how you think about how ideas can be developed, repurposed and reimagined in order to be able to create new futures and new ways of looking at the same situation. Film played a heavy part of what I was always into, and so these are three of the films. So if you don't know them, check them out because they're all very pivotal in very different ways. You need to take risks. If change is going to be made, you can't continue doing what you do or follow the same mold or mode of doing things in order to be able to make changes. So myself and this photographer, Dean Chalkley, back in 2013, we'd been working on a campaign together, and as a process of that development, we were making observations about what else was going on at the time. And Dean had said to me, look, I keep seeing these guys that have this kind of embody something different that I'm not used to seeing at the moment. And I'd said, look, I've seen a very similar thing, and essentially it reminds me of rude boy. And rude boy being a term which originated in Jamaica in the late 1950s. And those of you who've witnessed any images or videos of the Windrush generation coming over in that time period would have witnessed some of the hallmarks and the statutes of what it means to be a rude boy in terms of how you would express and present yourself and the ideology that would go along with that. There's more subtext that go with that, but I don't know how much time we have to go deeply into that. But rude boys essentially means Jamaican bad man, and it kind of every society has what would have been those who are on the fringes of society, who choose to live by their own rules. And usually it's because socio-political situations at the time will quite often force people down certain routes where there isn't an equilibrium within resource and with access to education and information for all. So therefore people take it upon themselves to be able to express themselves by any means necessary in the way that they will communicate moving forward within what it is that they do. So, which is the next slide? So, the Rude Boys who came to the UK, they had a really strong imprint on what would happen within UK culture. So there were a lot of mods, there were a lot of skinheads, and there were also punks who really identified with these outsiders and the way that they expressed themselves and the way that they presented themselves. So here you've got images of Joe Strummer from The Clash with Mikey Dread, and then this is a title of one of the songs on The Clash's first album, London Calling, called Rudy Can't Fail. And then you've got the skinheads who'd adopted a rude boy way of being and a rude boy kind of attitude. So there's that point where culture had converged and where the indigenous white kids who weren't necessarily feeling that much affinity in terms of what it was that they were doing, the working class kids, they found an affinity in these newcomers who looked different to them, sounded different, dressed different, danced different, and that point of separation also kind of brought an affinity and some kind of connectivity together at certain points, even though it then went on to fracture in different ways. And here we've got, here's where the slides stop working. There's Bob Marley and the Wailers. So before Bob became Rastafarian, he was a rude boy. This is the film The Harder They Come in the 70s with Jimmy Cliff. And then here's The Specials, where that total embodiment of Jamaican culture and British culture fusing together to make something much more powerful. And we did test the slides earlier. Apologies, everyone. So how Dean and I responded to this story was we started photographing a number of individuals, whether we shot them all in London, even though some of them weren't from London, some of them from the States, some from Portugal, some from Norway, but they happened to come through to London. And there's that point where we'd start telling a story about culture by documenting these different individuals and what it was that being a rude boy, as we saw it, this third incarnation of what it meant to be rude boy and how they would present themselves. So we created this exhibition which ran for 10 weeks in the summer of 2014 at Somerset House, and each room within the exhibition told a different facet of that story. So this was room 1, which was the migration, and the room which showed the kinds of suitcases that those first migrators on the Windrush, not the first black people to come to this country, but those people that came over in that wave. These are the kind of cases and the kind of the valises and the trunks that they would use. So over the 6 rooms that we had at Somerset House, we started to tell the story and break down different aspects of the culture through the artifacts and through the pieces that we would create, so that the photographs sat within a wider framework of familiar references that people could identify with. So then each room that we went through, this is not playing ball today, each room that we went through told a different aspect of that story. So in room 3 we had the barbershop, and anyone who came through could get their hair cut, be they regardless of race, regardless of gender, but the barbershop was open, that people could come through and have that taste and essence of culture that meant that they could start to have an understanding what the different hallmarks and the different tropes within certain cultures could mean. And in terms of the project being a success, it was that point where when we initially presented it to Somerset House, they said, you might get maybe 30,000 people, because that's what we would normally expect from a summer show here. And in the end, we ended up with over 65,000 people coming through. And there's a point where, as a commercial point of view, people really resonated it with the project. And we had visitors from far and wide, from around the country, and we had press that covered the project, from the Observer through to the New York Times and the Washington Post at various points. And the whole point of it was to be able to show how culture has had a relevance, one culture has got relevance and has had an impact on another culture, and how when you bring things together, how much more positive things can be when you're presenting different narratives. And we all know stories about mods, about skinheads and about punks, and the rude boy would come out occasionally, but very few people knew how important and how pivotal the rude boy relationship within British subculture actually could be, and actually was. And so these were the different commissions, as we commissioned different artists to create these outfits and these pieces, which kind of summed up the amalgamation of what it meant to be rude boy and have rude boy style. Whenever you're looking at projects, it's always about looking at design challenges, but from different angles. Clients will come to you and they'll present you with one thing, and we always think it's really important that you break down that brief, you reframe it, you reword it, and you represent it back to them in a way that makes complete sense for you, not that you just try and tick the boxes in order to pay for that campaign coming in, but you actually challenge what's being offered, not for the sake of challenging it, because sometimes it's about just pulling out the threads that are in there, but it's about challenging it in order to be able to get the truths and the real narratives and the real nuances. This is an album campaign that we did for the band Rudimental. Rudimental came to us a few years ago and said, look, we'd love to work with you. We've heard about the way that you work. We'd like to work with a certain kind of motif, and we'd love you to pitch on it, but we want you to work in this way. And we said, no, we can't work trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, but what we can do is look at the way that you work and try and upscale it and present it in a new way. So their first two album campaigns and stadium tours had all been based around sound systems. And when they came to us, they were saying, we're putting those into storage. We don't want to work with those anymore. We want to take a new direction. And we said, the way that you need to look at this is you can still use sound system culture as a point of reference, but try and look at it from a different angle. And so instead of just looking at it from the point of view of speakers, let's look at sound system culture in terms of from a graphic point of view and from an identity point of view, where in Jamaica, sound system dances and parties and events, as much as everyone uses social media, there's still a communication tool, which is with hand-painted signs. So whenever you're going around the island, you'll see these hand-painted signs which give notification to an up-and-coming dance or party or club that might be going on. So we said, as a visual point, that could be an extension of what you did with sound systems, but showing it in a completely new way. So the ideas that we started presenting to them were the album was called A Toast to Our Differences, and it's 4 separate guys that have come together and those differences and how they play themselves out. So we then took some of their ideas, and then how about we using the dancehall signage ideology and presenting that in an incongruous way, and how do we travel to different places, and how do we present in different ways that would allow that story to be shared. The album had been mixed and remixed with different artists from around the world, from Stefflon Don to Chronix to Rita Ora to many, many different people. And the idea was that it needed to have a sunshine vibe, along with the fact that there's this dancehall imagery, but it's not a reggae album. So even though the inspiration comes from reggae and they've got 2 or 3 reggae artists on it, it needs to have a wider scope than that. So we looked at these early images from Carnival and the incongruousness of having this World one plane kind of painted up on the middle of Portobello. We looked at the work of JR, and we looked at how we could start to think about the graphics and the visuals being represented in different places around the world. So each single cover would have a different story. So from all of that ideating and mood boards, we came up with this campaign where we ended up going to Portugal, and we took an artist with us, a fine art painter, and the idea being that apart from their logo, there would be no graphics in any of the covers other than what we created as we went along. And it was to be this organic process that would feel similar to hand-painted design. And so each one would be this journey and this narrative, and the different spaces that we found would be able to showcase the different idea behind each different cover. So here, for example, we went to outside of Lisbon down to the coast, and we turned the cover Summer Love. We took over this fisherman's painting shack, and we painted the title on it there. We painted onto garments, we painted onto flags, we painted anything that we could see that would give a sunshine vibe, which refers back to early references within dancehall culture, but was giving it a new purpose and a new spin and a new way of looking at things. And then we created this. This is the album cover, and it was this nominal person, someone who works in my studio actually, Bevan, who became this abstract figure character that would sum up what it meant to be this toast to our differences, as we had this bath in the middle of this straw field, and then with the back cover following through all the details of dancehall styles, dancehall signs as the back cover. Here is a little animation that we made for it to go along with it. So there it's bringing through those 7-inch ideas, which again linked with dancehall culture. So it's the references are there, the hallmarks are there, and it's about how we would present relevant culture, but for a commercial objective, and being able to go deeper with the references that were there. It's going to finish with this project. As I said earlier, you should try and rewrite the brief, but you rewrite it in order to tell authentic stories. We just did a takeover on the Platform Show studio from the 1st to the 6th of July. And in light of everything that's going on, where people are re-looking at racism within different industries and within society, they offered the opportunity to hold the platform and present a series of almost whatever it would be. So we created a series of conversations and a series of visuals, and we called it Notes on the Things, and it was a journal that would be taking place where we interviewed 12 people over 6 days, and we created a montage narrative and a series of conversations that we would have each day. And the idea is that those conversations would be with frontline workers as well as the designers. So we spoke to educators, we spoke to security, we spoke to photographers. We didn't only speak to the fashion designers, who would normally be those that would be platformed or would be presented on that platform. And it was just finding that other way of showing references that wouldn't normally be shown, showing aspects of black culture in its widest sense, in where we draw references from, and then also some of the people that we interviewed, where they draw references from. And so we were able to create this kind of, this developed this developed story and this like ongoing conversation, but in a visual sense. So you would get the montage coming through, and then you'd have interviews coming through, and you're able to build up these different layers and presenting culture in a new way.
Thank you so much, Harris. And there's been a nice lot of questions coming in, so I'm just going to fire straight in if that's okay.
Cool, go for it.
And if anyone has any extra, then do open the Q&A box and drop them in there. So the first one I wanted to ask is from Dylan, and he wanted to know, so how can you remain true to other cultures that you adopt and enjoy without appropriating those cultures or appearing to be a culture vulture?
So what we tend to do is about how much time you can spend working with those cultures. And quite often when you're given commercial projects, you don't always necessarily have the time that you would ideally like, because it's almost like a research process needs to take place in order to be able to develop that in to its thorough kind of extent. We try to call what we do almost like sampling or remixing, and the fact is that we always work with the cultures that are. I've worked in Japan for 20 years, and so obviously I'm not Japanese, and we've done projects with the Japanese government with punks from the Tokyo punk scene, and it's always about getting down on the level and having their authentic stories. So you collaborate with, so that it's their stories that are being told, not our version of their story. So I'm here to, or we're here as a studio to be able to present what it is that you do, and we become the facilitator because you've seen how we're able to present kind of other people's truths and bring those together. So it's always about sharing, it's not about dictating. And if you're ever, quite often you'll see photographers that will go out and they'll go and shoot something because it looks cool, and then but quite often they're doing it with a view of just getting more commercial work. So the people that they're photographing get no remuneration when they get those campaigns or whatever it is that they were getting from it. And so it's about how honest and accountable are you going to be with the different audiences that you're working with, so that they also have a platform or there's reinvestment and that they get paid fairly for their contribution to the project that you do.
Thank you. So the next one here from Oliver, it's interesting. So he's saying that punk movement is a prime example of a victim of its own success. The movement sparked more global appeal and has become watered down as a result. So how can you kind of avoid that in the work that you do? Or, yeah.
So no, as we know, there's very few original initial stories, but the way that we present something becomes original or becomes unique for those that are telling that story. And so it's how far you're willing to push back with those that are commissioning you, if it's coming from a commission point of view, because there comes a point where we all know where we've sat in those meetings, or maybe you don't, but you sit in those meetings and someone's asking you to do something, and that point where you start to feel uncomfortable that actually you've already stepped over a line when you're sidestepping certain aspects of what it is. No, but we need to show this and we need to show, and it's kind of, there's that point when you're prepared to walk out of a meeting, or the fact that, say something like punk, it's knowing that punk was created, or punk evolved at a time for that time, and it essentially wasn't something to be referred back to, it was something that was to continue evolving, similar to the modernist movement, or so many of these things. They're created as a reaction of what's going on. There was no legacy intended when the Clash, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones were creating stuff. They were creating something for what responded to their times. So if what you're doing authentically responds culturally, critically, and artistically to the times that you're living in, then that makes sense and you're telling a true story. If we're just rehashing something, so even when I was working with the Japanese punks, some people would look and say, well, they're not as hardcore as, say, the punks in Britain or in America, but it was true for them and they were living it in their way. So it's not for me to say what you're doing is a pastiche and it's not authentic, because these guys literally lived and breathed it every day in their way. And so that's the way that they understood it. And so my point of view wasn't to critique them, but was to share their story, and then people can take from it, whether they feel it is authentic enough or not. So it's how you kind of respond in that way.
Thank you. So another question is, so you're an art director, stylist, designer. It's fairly safe to say that you're maybe a generalist, or perhaps that's a phrase that you dislike or embrace. So that's the first part of the question. And then the second part is then, how do you avoid being perceived as a jack of all trades?
See, that's not an easy one, and it's taken years to be at the point where people commission for what it is that you bring to the table. But there's a thread that runs through the work, and the thread that runs through the work is culturally referenced responses, and culture is at the heart of what we do. So whether we're working in Thailand, within whatever country that we're working with, it's telling authentic cultural stories. And so if do less styling these days than used to, even though we still do it from the studio, but any aspect still has as much authenticity, whether you've been asked to create a film for somebody or you've been asked to do the element of styling or the art direction. So it's trying to know what your vision is, and if your vision is really clear, there'll be certain projects that you'll either say no to or you'll do them, but they won't fit on your resume or on your website, because if it's certain projects you'll do which end up just being for financial reasons, which will then allow you to continue presenting your vision. And I think it's just making sure that what you lay out is really clear for people to see that we will get this or an amplification of this for us in however that's going to look. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, I think so. So I was wondering also, this one's come in from a couple of people actually. So where you mentioned some of the kind of previous references that you draw inspiration from.
Yeah.
Where do you find that inspiration now? Is there a particular place you turn to?
I don't like being confined. So lockdown has been really, really hard for me, from the point that I don't normally find inspiration just through scrolling through Google searches or other kind of visual media. It's normally out and about that you see something or you see someone. It's maybe the way two colours have been put together, even if it's just through paint that is dried in a different way. To say like the dancehall references that we use for Rudimental, that was because there was a producer who'd been collecting all of these signs for years. And for 30 years, she's been collecting dancehall signs. And she made a bit of a book. So, and it was from reading that book, and that was in my head. And then a few years later, when this project came up, all right, okay, my fascination for the graphics within that could work really well with this application. So it's through reading, and then it's just through observing, but trying to look more out rather than down. And then when you're using your laptop or your phones, that's to kind of support further development rather than being the starting point.
I've got time for one more. This one came in quite early on, and someone's asking kind of what for you is that sign of success? What's the measure of success for the kind of work that you do? Is it through clicks or follows, or is there another thing that you...
No, it's definitely not through clicks or follows, because as much as you can track that and you can accumulate that data, it doesn't really mean that much. And so one of the things I've been pleased about because of lockdown is that there's almost like a death to the influencer. Influencers are dead, and it should be, there's a good friend of mine who owns this studio, Layla, Platform 13, it's about the influence rather than the influencer. And so success for me is when you work with people and you've exceeded what their expectations were for what it was that you were going to create, and that when you can still look back at that project in 3 months or a year or 2 years later and still feel quite proud that it did what it was supposed to do, and it still is able to not necessarily be timeless but still holds its own alongside other work that you create. Because I get quite, as a lot of creators, you get bored of your own work really quickly. So if your work can still stand the test of time and can still hopefully inform or inspire, then I think success comes as a marker of time if that idea still holds its own much further down the line.
I think that sums it up really, really nicely.